On behalf of the National Archives and Records Administration, welcome back to Part 3 of the Becoming America lecture series, titled The Bill of Rights and the Guarantees of Liberty. Tonight's lecture is titled The First Amendment, Our Freedom to Speak, Assemble, Print, and Petition the Government. Our lecturer is Rob Robinson, and I would like to welcome to the stage.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for having me out here. It is, like with all of our lecture series, it is extremely intimidating to take something like the First Amendment's free speech clause and try to distill it into something in 45 minutes, but I will give it my best shot. So here are the main points that I'm going to be looking at going forward in this particular talk. The first thing I want to discuss is that the text of the Bill of Rights, the text of the free speech clause, doesn't do a lot for us in terms of helping us figure out what speech is actually protected. And I'm going to illustrate that. Once we get past that, I'm going to talk a bit about how our current free speech system works, for the basics, the fundamentals, what speech gets the most protection and what speech gets less protection, and why. The third thing I want to talk about in the process of looking at these different tiers is that this country has changed quite a bit in terms of what speech it protected then versus now. The basic theme of this third point is that we value free speech far more today than, for example, the framers did. I want to talk a bit about why that is and what has changed. And then the last thing I want to talk about, a couple of the challenges that face First Amendment doctrine, that face free speech as it's currently constituted, focusing in particular on social media and the wide availability of what some scholars have called cheap speech, in the sense that it is now very easy to broadcast, for example, misinformation about a variety of topics all over the world at lightning speeds, and our current speech doctrines don't have a good way of dealing with these problems. Some of the solutions to deal with these problems might also lessen the freedoms that we have now. It's a very tough situation. I'm not going to provide any solutions to these problems. If I had that, I would be more famous and probably have a couple books to my name. But I will at least lay out the problems that are facing us. So I want to start first with simply the text of the First Amendment, focusing here on the speech clause. And I will read out the part that is most relevant. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That's it. That's the entire text. If we think about this for even a second, it becomes pretty clear that no law can't actually mean no law. Let me give you a few examples of this in action. Imagine that you somehow have come across the location of special forces units abroad, in Afghanistan or wherever, and you decide to put those on Twitter. And when the government comes to arrest you for putting our troops in danger, for exposing national security secrets, if you say, oh, well, I have a First Amendment right to say whatever I want, no law means no law, you will still go to jail. Or imagine you are trying to use your speech to commit fraud. You're trying to pitch something to someone that doesn't work and to do it for money, right? That is also a type of speech that is not protected by the First Amendment. Or as a third example, this is an actual screenshot of some messages that I believe a pitcher for the Cincinnati Reds got after a particularly bad ball game. So this is a real insane fan somewhere threatening to find him and kill his family. We don't expect threats, true threats, meaningful threats, not jokes. We don't expect threats to deserve First Amendment protection. And I think if you ask anyone on the street, are these the sorts of things that the First Amendment should protect? They would say, well, no, that doesn't make sense. We don't care about those things. So we already have a problem, right? No law doesn't actually mean no law. The framers assumed, and we also assume today, that there are some exceptions built into that principle. What are they? How do we know when something is fully protected and something isn't protected? And so what you can take from this is that when the text of the Constitution doesn't give you the answers that you need, which is almost always the case, by the way, any other Bill of Rights, any other grant of power, the text alone is just a starting point. If you want to explain what speech should be protected, you have to go beyond just looking at the text and think about a theory of what the First Amendment is supposed to do. Why do we have a free speech clause? What is its purpose? And again, I'm not going to list every possible way of thinking about this, given the time span of the talk. I do want to give you 3 examples of different theories of free speech and how those different theories might lead to different results if people are being censored or if there are laws that are being challenged as violating the First Amendment. One argument that you will hear often, and I think this is one of our core beliefs about the First Amendment, is that it exists primarily, maybe not exclusively, but primarily to protect speech about politics. Because if you reflect on this for a moment, you can't have a functional democracy if people are not able to get together and discuss what the right policy should be. If you can't argue about what path the government should take, if you can't criticize the government for making mistakes. If those things aren't possible, how can you have a democracy? If we can't talk about the political process, elections, voting, who's right, who's wrong, it's hard to imagine democracy working properly. So that's one theory of the First Amendment, is that it exists to protect political speech, whatever that means. That's a broad term itself, right? And it is the case that typically political speech is still seen as the core of what we care about in protecting. But there are other theories of the First Amendment that are also important and have gained traction. Another is that the First Amendment protects the search for truth. And this could be truth in an absolute sense. What is the right morality? What are the proper values? How should our culture be set up? Or it could be about you and your own personal, individual search for truth. How should you live your life? What's most important to you? And you can see this process play out not just in the realm of morals or philosophy, but also in science. What actually works in science? How do we test stuff? Or in art, literature, music, right? These are all areas of life where people have different ideas about what is good and beautiful. And so there's a concept I have here on the slide set called the marketplace of ideas. And this is a concept that the Supreme Court helped popularize in some cases in the 1920s. It is basically the concept that when we're thinking about what ideas are better, true, good, helpful, at a scientific level work, the default position should be that these ideas compete in a kind of marketplace rather than being chosen at the top by the government. Right? So rather than the government saying, this is the right way to do science, we have peer-reviewed journals and test stuff and run experiments and try to replicate it. Rather than having the government say, this is the kind of music that is good, we get to listen to music that is good or bad and disagree about it, right? Like an actual marketplace, the marketplace of ideas as a concept has some pretty serious flaws and shortcomings, right? For example, not everyone has an equal amount of speech in the marketplace of ideas. If I owned a television network, I'd be a lot more powerful player in the ability to speak, right? I'm not. I'm talking to you here on YouTube, which is still great, by the way, but it is not my own news station. That aside, though, the marketplace of ideas has become popular as a concept because it treats as a default position that the best way to figure out whether something is good is just to have it compete among the public, among the majority, and see what ideas rise up over time to become more popular and which ones fall away. And then the third theory you might embrace is just that the reason why we have free speech is that so we can speak freely. Now, that's a tautology, I guess, but the basic idea behind this one is it doesn't matter whether my speech furthers the democratic process. It doesn't matter whether my ideas contribute to some search for truth. I should have the right to say the things that I want because I am a free individual who should not be limited by society or the government, except at some extreme level where my speech might do some sort of harm to others. What type of theory the court supports is actually pretty important for determining what kind of speech gets protected. So, for example, imagine we live in a world where the first theory on the left is the one the court embraces. And then the question is asked, can the government ban Game of Thrones? Or, any further spin-offs of Game of Thrones, right? Because these shows, they're pretty fun, but they're also very violent, right? There's a lot of sexual violence. And so under a theory that free speech is about the democratic process, you might say, well, Game of Thrones doesn't play any important role in the political process, we can ban it. If by contrast you care about truth or freedom, you might say, well, it's not the government's job to pick what shows we're going to watch and think about. That's the job of the marketplace. Shows should be condemned or praised among the public without government interference. Or for the freedom principle, you could say, well, it's not your business what I want to watch, right? I should get to watch whatever I want. Who should tell me what to do there? And at different points in time, the court has adopted different theories, which leads to different results. Today, I would tell you that all three of these things are important and embraced in various places. So beyond just sort of these abstract values or theories that I've discussed, now I want to get a little more specific and talk about what current speech doctrine in the United States looks like. And when I say this, I am talking about sort of the general approach to free speech. Like a lot of things in constitutional law, there are 1,000 exceptions. There are 1,000 different little categories that get their own rules, their own tests. Given, again, the framework of this lecture series, I'm going to focus on sort of the general framework rather than getting down into the weeds. Again, as I discussed talking about the text of the Constitution not giving us all the answers that we need, it's become apparent over the years and decades that in order to have functional speech doctrine, you can't protect everything. Like no law, again, can't mean no law. There has to be things that are more or less protected. And Justice Blackmun in a 1992 case has a nice quote that summarizes this view fairly well. He says, if we give pornography or cigarette advertising, the same level of protection that we give core political speech, we're going to end up reducing protection across the board. We have to have things that we protect less and things that we protect more. And those are going to be based on our values, like democracy or truth or freedom. And the values that we have as our values have changed over time. What speech gets protection, deserves protection, has changed. And again, the basic story of this country for the First Amendment's free speech clause is increasing protection, sometimes, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but increasing protection over time in line with cultural changes. And to give you some specifics, I would distill this down into 3 levels. The oldest sort of tier, core, center, or heart of the First Amendment, going back centuries, so well before the creation of the United States, is that the government cannot engage in what are called prior restraints. And that basically means before the fact censorship. So imagine that you are the editor of the LA Times and you want to publish stories. But every time you want to publish a major story, you have to run it by a California board of censors first. And they could say, no, this is too controversial, or this is going to make some people really angry, or this story has the wrong values, you can't run this. That would be a prior restraint. And even the founding fathers, who were not nearly as protective of free speech as we are today, understood that this was an evil that should not be allowed. They were perfectly fine, as we'll see in a second, to punish you if you said the wrong thing. But they weren't going to censor you on the front end. Beyond that, in today's doctrine, you have what is considered protected speech. And honestly, I would think of it this way. Most speech is protected speech. But then at the bottom, there are some categories of speech that deserve or get less protection. These are sometimes called unprotected categories. I think that's a misnomer because they still get some protection from the court, but usually a lot less. It's a lot easier to be prosecuted, for example, if you're threatening people, if you're engaging in fraud, if you're telling lies about someone's reputation so you libel them. And again, the framers' view basically was that only prior restraints were prohibited by the First Amendment. That's what free speech meant. No government censorship beforehand. No board of censors that you have to submit your work to before it can be published. But if, after the fact, the community determines that your speech is dangerous, it disrupts order, right? You say something crazy like, "There is no God," in 1789. And don't say it kind of in a quiet, clever way, like a lot of people did. You just come right out and say that. You might be punished for it. And in fact, this is something that you may be aware of if you've taken any high school history classes. But there was a law passed by the same people, pretty much, who had been around in the founding generation in 1798 called the Alien and Sedition Acts. For our purposes, what is important about this law is that it made it illegal to criticize or make fun of the president. Now, to me, that seems counter to the heart of any of our major theories of free speech, right? If you can't criticize a public figure, what is the First Amendment for? But again, their view was that it was fine to punish people after the fact for saying something that might disrupt social order. The values of the 18th and 19th century often put social order above freedom, particularly if you were an outsider, if you advanced views that were outside the mainstream. So if you're engaging in sort of a debate that the two major parties are arguing about, you're likely to be fine. But if you were to come out and say, for example, slavery is evil and we should amend the Constitution to abolish it, you might have a mob come burn down your house, destroy your printing press, in this particular case, kill you, because you said things that made people angry. And so for most of the country's history, we lived in an era that was not particularly speech protective. It's a relatively recent thing, certainly by historical standards and even by the standards of the United States. And I think that's important to understand because the fact that our free speech doctrine has not been permanent means that it has to be maintained. It's not automatic as a system of our government. It's something that has to be supported by political and legal elites, supported by the culture. What you did see in the 20th century is that there was a change in the culture. At the legal level, at the political level, people began to value freedom more and worry about disruption of social order a little less. And when I say people, I'm doing an averaging here. Obviously, there are plenty of people who don't fit the bill on this. But as the 20th century ground on, the Supreme Court increasingly got involved in protecting the First Amendment and increasingly defended claims of individual freedom against potential threats to order, stability, or equality. They began to take this marketplace of ideas concept more seriously, that the government should not be punishing people for the things that they say just because they make people angry. And in fact, what you really see here is kind of sort of a flip-flop. Rather than society being able to punish things that are outside the mainstream, now the default position really is you have freedom of speech unless there's some specific harm or problem that your speech might cause, like a threat to someone that makes them fear for their life, like defrauding someone with a fake claim about your product, or libeling someone, lying about them and hurting their reputation. So free speech becomes more of the norm as the court begins to protect freedom more than order or stability. And so again, this is a cultural change, it's a value change. Constitutional law sometimes is just values written into case doctrine. An example of this change might be for obscenity. So obscenity is a legal category that today includes some, but not all, pornography. And the idea is that at some extreme, pornography is not protected by the First Amendment. If it's hardcore enough, it can be deemed legal obscenity and then can be criminalized, although it almost never is because prosecutors typically have other needs or priorities, and it's so ubiquitous it's hard to censor and so on. But under older views of this, obscenity was defined as, from an older British test, anything that might deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences and to whose hands such a publication may fall. So that's antiquated language. I'll translate this in today's terms. Anything a kid might get their hands on, and it could be bad for that kid, should not be published. Think about that for a second. Adults can only read things that would not be fit for children. And a lot of great literature by today's standards was actually considered legally obscene. So I don't know if people had to read Ulysses in high school, read Joyce. I escaped from this, a bit of a Philistine, I guess. But Joyce, this book is considered to be one of the greatest works in the English language, or at least of the past 100 years. And yet for a good chunk of the early 20th century, it was actually illegal to import from Europe because it had a few depictions of kind of rough and ready depictions of, I guess, working class Irish behavior that talked about sex a little bit, right? By today's standards, not even close to legal obscenity. But again, this was a change in the culture. We came to value people's ability to choose for themselves what they get to read more than concerns just about the sort of instability that sexual immorality might cause. And so in 1933, a lower court judge basically said, look, whatever obscenity is, this isn't it. Like, obscenity can't be a novel that's not mostly about sex. And my point in bringing this up is just to show you that the categories of what is considered appropriate or inappropriate, protected or unprotected, change as the culture changes. And those changes unevenly get applied by the courts. It's not always a one-to-one. Sometimes the courts is a bit ahead of the culture, and sometimes they're a bit behind. But I think there is a relationship there to think about. So what is the basic standard today for speech? It is something called content discrimination. This is the basic rule that governments have to abide by today for most of the situations in which the free speech clause might be implicated. So, for example, you want to have a parade. You want to give a speech outside, and the police say, no, you can't do that. This might be where content discrimination comes in. The basic idea here, like the name suggests, is that the government is not allowed to regulate speech based on the content of what is being said. It takes that marketplace of ideas seriously. So the government says, we're going to ban your speech because it's crazy, it's hateful, it's evil, it's immoral, it's irreligious, whatever. That is something that the current understanding of the First Amendment does not allow, except in very rare circumstances. And just so we're clear on what this means, content discrimination is, for example, could be the topic of speech that we're talking about. This also could include the narrower category of viewpoint discrimination. And let me give you an example of this. I'll jump ahead for a second. This might be an example of content discrimination. So imagine that a city, and there actually are a fair number of sign law cases that go to the Supreme Court, strangely enough. But imagine a city says you are allowed to put up for sale signs outside your house, but you can't put up any political signs. Because political signs are divisive, there's too many of them, it makes people angry. So we're going to say that you can only put up for sale signs, but not signs about political candidates. That would be an example of content discrimination, right? You're treating some types of speech differently than others based on the content of what the sign says. And that is, again, de facto unconstitutional. There might be a few situations where it's allowed, but for the most part, governments aren't allowed to do that. It's up to us in the marketplace of ideas to decide what type of speech is good or bad, what type of sign we should put in our lawn. There's also something within this called viewpoint discrimination, and that's just a narrower subset of content discrimination. So if content discrimination could be you can't ban political signs but allow for sale signs, viewpoint discrimination might be, okay, you're allowed to have Democratic Party signs up but not Republican Party signs up, or vice versa. That's also bad. The government's not supposed to take sides in these sorts of debates. And again, there are situations where this might be allowed, but for the most part, you can't do it. And if the government tries to do it, they'll go to court and they'll lose. By contrast, there's another type of law, a content-neutral law, that's given a lot more deference by the courts and is a lot more likely to be upheld. So a content-neutral law is the kind of law that we have to have in order to live in a society, right? So if the government says, look, your group can't give a speech because we don't like what you have to say, that's content discrimination. But if the government says, your group can't give a speech at 3 in the morning because everybody is asleep, that's content neutral, right? It applies to everybody equally, neutrally, regardless of what they want to say. And there are all sorts of laws like this, right? There are noise laws in most jurisdictions. There are laws about how late you can be speaking or causing noise. We don't necessarily allow people to walk down the freeway, right? Because it hurts traffic or might get people killed. So as long as the regulation in question is neutral in regards to the speaker and what they're saying, much more likely to be upheld by the government. And in fact, generally is upheld by the government. A couple of exceptions. I'll give you an example of each. Sometimes governments try to ban something content neutrally, but what they're really doing is going after a specific group. And this is often a question of timing. So let's say, for example, that you pass a content-neutral ban that limits the ability of people to speak in public, but it turns out you did it just before a group that you don't like is coming to town. That's suspicious, right? So maybe the court might look at that and decide that you're really not you don't care about noise really or any of the other neutral problems. You care about censoring those people. There have been other cases where jurisdictions have said, fine, we have to be content neutral. No one can talk. Now we're neutral, right? We're good. This reminds me of jurisdictions after Brown versus Board of Education. They would say, fine, if we have to integrate swimming pools, we'll just shut them all down. And that way we're not violating based on race anymore, right? We're just saying no one can swim. Well, that's not a result that we want, right? We don't want the government to censor those it doesn't like by saying no one can talk. And so that's an exception to this sort of principle. You can't be content neutral by demanding everyone be silent. So this is the basic sort of framework in which our speech laws in this country operate, and they tend to protect each of the theories that we talk about. They protect democracy because people who have unpopular positions can still speak them and be part of the democratic process. It allows us to search for truth without the government shutting down particular avenues of inquiry. And it allows us to be freer because a lot of the time we can say what we want regardless of whatever the content of our speech is, while still allowing the government to regulate things that, if someone could speak loudly outside my window every night at 3 in the morning, that would be a problem, right? Like in the long run, that's not a good way to run things. So this is a sort of compromise or framework that the court has run for the past 30 or 40 years and really shows no signs at present of changing. All right. Let me finish up by talking about some of the problems that I think face us today. Because as I've tried to show during this talk, a lot of our free speech law is based on our culture. It's based on our values. But it also relates to changes in technology. As you can imagine, TV, the internet, cable, the radio, all had people thinking about, well, what does the radio mean for the First Amendment? What does television mean? Should television be protected the same way? Should the internet be protected the same way? And so anytime there's a technological change in the delivery of speech or messages, the court sometimes has to rethink what to do. So I would say a couple of things. Before we get to the social media, the cheap speech, the technology, I think another challenge facing our country is political polarization. So when I teach American government at Cal State Fullerton, where I work, I say polarization a lot because it seems to be a common problem in a lot of the areas that we discuss. And by polarization, I simply mean division. This country is fairly divided right now, particularly among political elites, but increasingly, I would argue, among the public. And I think one of the side effects of political polarization is a desire to shut up your opponents by whatever way you can do that. Probably, if you're listening, you have heard of the term cancel culture. I don't want to get too deep into arguing about what that means and does it exist. But it's certainly the case that people often use either the marketplace of ideas or sometimes even state power to try to get people who say things they don't like to stop talking. And a lot of our free speech doctrine, the content discrimination and content neutrality cases that I discussed a second ago, a lot of those were developed in a period of American history where polarization was lower, particularly among political party lines. You could be a Democrat, but be very, very different in Georgia versus California versus Minnesota. Today, by contrast, the parties have more in common with each other or with themselves and less with each other. And as that division increases, the temptation, the desire to go after our opponents becomes stronger. I don't think anyone is immune from this, liberal, conservative, moderate. I think the general human tendency is when we read or hear things that horrify us or make us angry. I think a normal reaction, if not a good one, is to think, how can I stop that? And as the country gets more divided, I think those tendencies will increase. And again, I don't want to get too deep into current affairs, but you see this in various places, people trying to, prohibit certain topics, declare something hate speech, ban books at the school level, whatever side of the aisle you are on. You can find examples of this. And I think it's dangerous because, as I tried to show you, free speech depends on the values and the culture that we support. It's not automatic. It doesn't flow mechanically from the Constitution. It only exists as long as we value it. And I admit, it is difficult to value speech that we hate. It's easy to value speech that you think is a joke or not dangerous. Anyone can tolerate that. Tolerating speech that you truly think is dangerous or harmful is a much taller task. And I'm not here to tell you that you must always support freedom first. But that is a trade-off that becomes more difficult as we start to dislike each other more. And that worries me, in part because no one really knows how to reduce polarization in this country. At least I don't know of any solutions. That's just something to worry about. And I think if you care about free speech as a value, it becomes more difficult to do so in the face of people you increasingly dislike saying things you increasingly dislike. Moving on to the social media cheap speech technological change challenges, there's a term coined by a couple of fairly famous law professors, both now at UCLA, Eugene Volokh and more recently Richard Hasen, who was down at Irvine and now is at UCLA. There's a term here called cheap speech. And cheap speech, basically, it's an economic term. It refers to how easy it is today, relative to, say, 50 years ago, to spread a message across the country. Like, imagine, if you will, like 1950, what you would have to do to get a message out to 1 million people. It'd be expensive, right? You need to run a television campaign, some sort of newspaper campaign, multiple newspapers. Today, you can just send out a tweet. And if it's viral, you might get a few 100,000 people look at it, right? So the ability of people to speak and reach an audience has exploded. It's really changed the game in a lot of ways. So Volokh, rather presently, I think, or presently, in 1995, coins this term, and he's kind of in the more early internet, optimistic, man, this is going to be great. Because we're no longer going to depend on elites, people with money, people with power to get our message out. Now anyone can get their message out. Right? Sort of the way that people initially thought the internet was going to democratize the world and everyone barriers would come down and we'd all get together and I don't know. And then in 2021, Hassan's like, well, the problem also is that anyone can say anything now and everyone can hear it. Like the bad side of that is the same as the good side of it, right? We used to have the problem of maybe not enough information. Now we drown in it. And I'm sure all of you, we all lived through COVID, right? If you're listening to this. It was difficult to know at any given time what to do, where to go, when to wear a mask, when to get the vaccine, how they worked. Even if you followed all the appropriate scientific protocols, sometimes those weren't clear. There's so much information out there that even someone who's acting in good faith, believes in science, reasonably intelligent, might struggle to separate truth from fiction, truth from falseness, bad information from good. And so because there is so much information out there, there's a lot of misinformation, there's increasingly a lot of hate speech out there that's easily accessible. There's some truly awful stuff on social media. Don't advise you go look for it, but it is there. There are lots of Nazis, for example, on Twitter, and they post stuff, and it's bad. It's all constitutionally protected, right? People struggle with this. People say, well, that can't be protected. It's bad. It's hate speech. It's evil. It's dangerous. Well, that's not how the marketplace of ideas works. The marketplace of ideas, for better or worse, says that the government can't normally choose what information is allowed to be published. Because if you give it that power, how do you trust it to do what is right? We don't typically. So you have all this blatantly false information. It could be something like, you tell people where, the wrong way to vote, and they try to do that and they break the law or something, right? All that sort of thing is legal and protected, and it creates a real problem because we don't have good tools for dealing with massive amounts of misinformation. People are out in some places in the world trying to get genocide to happen, right? They're advocating killing each other, and maybe not in a way that actually violates the law. In this country, it's very hard to go to jail for advocating a crime. You have to work really hard at it, to be honest. And so we have a doctrine that's very speech protective, but in line with just a massive amount of quote unquote low value speech. And it's made worse, I think, by the fact that we are divided. We trust each other less. We trust institutions less, whether that's medicine, doctors, the government, the military, police, whatever. And we also used to have a fairly robust local journalism industry in this country that is contracted, in some places just died, because newspapers used to depend on ads to make ends meet and selling personals and stuff. Internet says, well, here's all that for free or super cheap, and it goes away. There's some places in the United States where you don't have a local paper at all, right? And so without good information, without trusted sources, you just get a lot of crap. And it makes it difficult to sort through. And then you have people who, either here or abroad, are literally just trying to stir up trouble. And you don't have to believe any particular theory about so-and-so country tried to steal the election or whatever. Foreign actors are trying to make us mad at each other. That is a thing, right? That's just part of what happens. And it's tough to know, I think. You know, people don't usually have "I am a Russian bot" on their Twitter account. Sometimes you can tell, but not always. Social media is entitled to full First Amendment protection. The Supreme Court's made this very clear. And so a lot of times, because we don't want to undo the doctrinal product of so many decades, we just sort of throw up our hands and say, well, that's the way it is. Now, another area where social media has weighed in, you've seen people argue about how much influence particular platforms have, right? There's a lot of wasted ink about who gets to be on Twitter or not, depending on whether Elon Musk is in charge or not, right? Who gets kicked off? What are the rules? People are arguing about it. For the most part, standard First Amendment doctrine says that a big platform can kick anyone off they like, just like I can kick you out of my house if I don't like you. It's their platform, right? But if the platforms get powerful enough, you might have concerns about monopolies and so on and so forth. And this is the technological change that I'm talking about. Is there going to be a point at which some of these private entities are sort of like the public square? Or not, right? If you're not on Twitter, you can be on Facebook or Instagram, or there's other platforms, right? There's Truth Social. I can't name all the smaller ones. So you could say that, it's not really, you're not kicked out of the public square. You just can't use this particular product. But that's what a lot of the fight about is too. What is the role of these giant private companies where we do a lot of our speaking now? How can we regulate them without undoing free speech? Because if you tell Twitter, you have to let so-and-so talk, you've taken away their speech rights, haven't you? But if Twitter says only certain people can talk, that might have a meaningful effect on people's realistic ability to talk. I don't have an answer for this problem. I'm just laying it out for you. But we have seen, for example, Texas, I believe, tried to make it illegal for Twitter and other social media to kick people off based on their political beliefs. That's probably unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court's going to hear it. And I actually don't know what's going to happen. I think they're going to strike the law down. But despite teaching constitutional law for a living, I'm wrong a lot about what the court does. So to conclude, we don't have good solutions for the problems that face us. We don't really know how to reduce polarization. We don't know how to reduce or to regain trust. This is something I tell my students sometimes. In the 1960s, about 70% of the country in a poll would say that they trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. Today, that is 20%, 30%. We don't know how to get back to a point where that kind of institutional or social trust exists. We don't know how to solve divisions between liberals and conservatives or Democrats and Republicans. Current free speech doctrine, number 2, pretty much protects all of the cheap speech, the misinformation, the hate speech that we worry about, because to let the government regulate that could potentially send us back to the 19th century. We don't want that. We want free discussion about democracy. We want the search for truth and freedom. But it's not great to have all this misinformation out there, right? People died because of misinformation about COVID. What do you do about that? I don't know. Government involvement, you could prohibit lies, you could punish misinformation, but those have pretty obvious, clear setbacks, right? How do we define what a lie is? How do we define what misinformation is? Who gets to make that call? Just pick the person you don't like in government running for president and give that power to them. That's a tough sell, isn't it? And then private ownership is central to the market society or mixed market society that we live in. If you try to force these platforms to host speech against their will, that's a violation under current doctrine. Again, there are clear downsides to the government getting involved, but you could maybe be a bit uneasy about a large platform kicking people off, and now, you know, you have lost some ability to speak in the public square, right? Like realistically, you have. So again, I have problems, I don't have solutions. We might just have to muddle through it. It's possible that the court will try to rebalance some of our doctrine in a way that it did in the 20th century, where it rebalanced in favor of freedom. Maybe it will rebalance away from it to care about other goals. I don't know. But it certainly is something to think about if you're watching this. You know, think about areas where you think it should change and where it shouldn't, but you know, be realistic that you can't have all of these good things at once. There are trade-offs. So with that, come to a conclusion. I greatly appreciate you listening to some of the discussion and structure of the First Amendment and the Free Speech Clause. Thanks for watching. Hopefully we'll see you next time.